Thank you for joining us. In chapters 9 and 10 in your book, Judaism Reclaimed, you critique Marc Shapiro's book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, for asserting that the Rishonim had major differences of opinions regarding the 13 principles of faith, most notably God's incorporeality. Shapiro paints a picture that certain French rabbis, including Rashi, believed it wasn't blasphemous to consider God physical. He also scoffs at the notion of having principles of faith, considering Chazal allegedly had such wide-ranging views. What is the basis of your critique of these claims?
So first of all, thank you very much. I'm honored to be on your podcast. Considering the range of guests, the range of topics that you're covering, I'm very happy and honored to be part of your project. So yeah, I'm not surprised you opened with that question, because really the feedback of the last couple of years of the emails and messages that I've received and people I've spoken to in person, there's a lot of interest in this chapter because, Dr. Shapiro wrote this book, bringing many sources, and the opening chapters of this book put forward some really very strong claims about Rashi, about the Talmudic scholars, that not as they believed that it wasn't blasphemous to consider God physical, but actually these scholars, these rabbinic scholars, these great revered figures in the Jewish tradition, actually believed God to have some kind of physicality, some kind of physical body, which of course Rambam would consider heretical. That's something which you lose your portion in the world to come for. So this is something which is very shocking to people, and it's something which I sat down, I looked up the sources, and I realized that it wasn't necessarily, his claims weren't really as strong as they first appeared. So it's quite a big topic. I'm going to try and separate it out into different sections. I mean, much of the critique of these opening chapters, I mean, it really is only the opening chapters of Marc Shapiro's book, which deal with God's indivisibility, physicality, but I found them to be a very simplistic presentation of the sources without really sufficient analysis or recognition of the counter considerations. Sometimes it even involves a thoroughly misleading set of quotations, such as when he cites Josephus or Marc or Moshe Cordovero. I'll bring that in a little bit later. But most importantly, well, in certain cases there is some kind of discussion to be had and debate over the beliefs of certain Talmudic or medieval sages or Kabbalistic beliefs. I found that Dr. Shapiro doesn't really have that debate. He presents things in simplistic, often provocative ways, as if they were foregone conclusions. And just an example of the sort of ramifications, the sort of effect that has when someone like Marc Shapiro comes and presents things a certain way. I found there are people who are intelligent students of Jewish thought who I've heard just repeating and citing his claims as if they were an unchallengeable source, saying, Rashi believed in a physical God, unaware of the complexities and the difficulties involved in making such a claim. And that's really what drew me in my book to address his theories. So, yeah, since we started with that story about Rashi, so let's start off with his analysis of Rashi. So there's quite a well-known piece of Rashi, which in his commentary to Shemot, which describes, it's on a pasuk talking about how God's hand is going to smite Egypt. And Rashi comments on that. God's hand, Yad Hashem, Yad Mamash, his real hand. And this is taken at a surface level as a case closed. Rashi therefore held this idea that God has a physical body. What is less known and is barely mentioned in Dr. Shapiro's work is that Rashi says many other things as well about Yad Mamash, and for example, elsewhere, even in the book of Shemot, he says Yad Mamash can be interpreted in many different ways. He uses it in the context of when Batya, the daughter of Paro, is waiting by the river. It says Al Yad Hanahar, which means right next to the river. And Rashi says Yad Mamash, meaning right next to the river. So however we put together all these sources, there's clearly more of a conversation to be had here. And even more powerfully, there are several times throughout Tanakh, particularly in the book of Yechezkel, we find that Yechezkel saying that the Yad Hashem, that the hand of God was upon me, so to speak, 2-3 times in the book of Yechezkel. And Rashi comments there a couple of times that any time in Tanakh that it says the phrase Yad Hashem, the hand of God, it refers metaphorically to the notion of God overpowering a human being, not a literal hand. And these are crucial sources which are not brought up by Marc Shapiro. So it's clear to me, at least, that he's aiming to look for certain provocative conclusions rather than a fair and balanced assessment of the sources. And this is before we get to more complicated sources, more complicated discussions, things written in the Mafsor Vitri by Rashi's student about how belief in a physical God is outright heresy. This is sort of mentioned obliquely in a footnote by Marc Shapiro, that the implications are huge. Rashi's own student saying that belief in a physical God is heresy. Where did he get it from if his own teacher was a heretic? And then we get on to, these are sources I do go through in the book, I'm not going to go through now, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, the famous recent scholar of Jewish philosophy, who brought in several sources from Rashi to say that he held a very sophisticated perception of God. He tries to argue similar to that of Rambam, whether we go along with that or not, but there's definitely a lot more discussion to be had here. And I'm concerned that people who just read these sources in Marc Shapiro's book come away with a very one-sided and warped impression of Rashi's position. And that's just the section dealing with Rashi. We come on to the Kabbalists. So Kabbalah is it's a whole system of symbolism and language that you really have to get inside before you can even talk about it. And this is both from an academic perspective and rabbinic perspective. You find this. Gershon Sholem talks about, I bring all the quotes in the book, he talks about how it's a set of symbols and language. And we find the Ramchal, the Maharal, other prominent Kabbalists who make it very clear that when we talk about God in certain physical terms, this is symbolizing certain interactions, whether it's something which Rambam would go along with or not, perhaps not, but it's not a clear example of the Kabbalists referring to God in a physical way, something which Rambam would consider heretical. Kabbalah talks in metaphors, symbols, attributes of God, not literal divisibility, that the 10 Sefirot are not divisible parts of God, they're not physical parts of God. It could be there are certain, maybe individual people who misunderstand Kabbalah, but the great sages, the Ramchal, the Sharei Orah, all of these great Kabbalic sages make it very clear this is not how they understand it. It's important to understand that the Kabbalists are speaking a different language to Rambam. And when Marc Shapiro comes along with Rambam's principles of belief and tries to apply them to Kabbalah, he needs to perform a major translation job, because Rambam and the Kabbalists, they inhabited different intellectual worlds. They spoke very different languages. That's not to say that they agreed on everything. There were major differences between the two. But in order to make any meaningful comparison between the world of Rambam and the world of Kabbalah, and to say that Kabbalah breaches Rambam's principles of faith, you need to do a lot more than present a few superficial and unexplained lines from the middle of Kabbalistic works. That's even assuming they're fairly quoted. I say that because we find something in particular in the middle of Marc Shapiro's discussion of Kabbalah, we find he quotes this passage from Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, his Pardas Rimonim, about God apparently being divisible, and by implication, physical, which is highly, highly misleading. He talks about how the emanation from God, these 10 different Sefirot, but if you actually look up the original source in the Pardas Rimonim, it's a long chapter. Rabbi Cordovero continues at length in a section which is, of course, not quoted in the limits of Orthodox theology. He continues at length to insist and explain that he specifically does not mean what Dr. Shapiro claims him to mean. So again, it's a lack of context. The same thing happens when he quotes Josephus, and there's no attempt to engage with and examine the system on its own terms, the symbolism, the language of Kabbalah. So again, this is something I try to do in my own book. I try to show, to build up what the symbolism, how the language of Kabbalah works, and then of course conclude in where Kabbalah is in common with Rambam, where of course there are many ways in which it disagrees with Rambam. Since, for example, Kabbalah looks to the attributes of God for us to relate to God in certain ways, through viewing God as having certain real attributes, whereas Rambam tries to move us away from that. There's certainly very significant differences, but to look at superficial Kabbalistic quotes, which both academics of Kabbalah and the great rabbis of Kabbalah have said are not literal sources, and to take those to say, well, these Kabbalists are going against Rambam's principles of faith, I found that to be very misleading. So that's Rashi, that's the Kabbalists, and we find also the Agadah, the Talmudic sages come under fire. We find Marc Shapiro quoting certain passages, and there are several pages of this in his book, several pages of Agadic teachings which describe God in human and physical terms, and then he draws what seems to be the obvious conclusion that the Talmudic sages believed in some kind of physical deity, but there's no context here. We find there's a rich, almost an overwhelming tradition of definitely among the earlier sages of not interpreting Agadah literally. Agadah uses powerful imagery often to project and teach certain religious, moral, spiritual ideas, but there are many Agadat which really sound bizarre, sound very strange if they're taken on a surface level. So is it accurate just to cite certain Agadat and say on the basis of a surface level reading that the sages held on to the physical conception of gods? These are sages who we find in many other Agadat where they describe God in some kind of physical term. They say Kibyachol, many times. I think there are dozens of occasions through the Agadat and the Midrashim where they describe God in some kind of physical way. They say Kibyachol, as if it was possible. And Marc Shapiro himself also quotes, he mentions, he concedes that there are certain ancient historians and certain Greek historians who know that the Jewish sages did not believe in a physical deity. So to put all of that together and then just cite several pages of Agadat which imply that God has a physical body and draw the conclusion, therefore, that the sages held of a physical deity, that to me is a very weak conclusion. There are many other bizarre Agadat, as we mentioned. For example, it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar's foreskin extended 300 cubits when he attempts to sodomize Tzidkiyahu. The letters of the alphabet having fights among themselves about who's going to start the alphabet. It's clearly there's more going on in Agadah than a surface level reading. So we cannot just take these Agadat of God doing certain things and images of God and say God wearing tefillin, and therefore they must have held that God had some sort of physical body. So yeah, that's a summary of the sort of sources I go into to dispute what I find to be the simplistic and sometimes misleading conclusions that Dr. Shapiro makes.
I wanted to ask you if you could back to the Yad Mamash, the first example that you went through. So how would someone understand that Rashi of Yad Mamash in the more nuanced way? Assuming that it doesn't really mean Yad Mamash, meaning the God as a hand. So what does that Rashi mean?
Well, if we equate it, for example, to the river, so Al Yad Mamash of the river means directly, very close to the river, whereas Al Yad not Mamash would mean somewhere near the river, but not very close. So it could be Yad Mamash could be a direct smiting by God. Okay. Whereas, I don't know, that's just off the top of my head. It could be there are other explanations there also.
God's active, more of a direct active participant in what's happening. It's not mediated angel.
Not through a malach or any sort of shaliach, any sort of messenger. So yeah, putting that Yad Mamash, that single comment, into the context of what he says, in Yechezkel, that all mentions of the hand of God are not to be taken literally, that just gives you a very different context within which to read that Rashi. And I found that context is very often lacking, and that's why I try to go into in this book to try and show some context to these claims, which many people sort of took on and quote that the Rashi and the Kabbalists and Talmudic sages held of physical conceptions of God.